Hi everybody, and welcome to Atheists of Facebook. My name is Deborah, or a Heretic Woman if you prefer, and I am the host of Beyond the Trailer Park, and I am also a panelist on Holy Crap the Vlogcast. Both are YouTube shows that appear weekly on YouTube and podcast form. You can find out more about how to see what those shows are all about at the credits at the end of the presentation. But today, I am here to talk to you about why marching to your own drum does not have to be a solo act. So, as atheists and secularists, I am willing to bet most of us have experienced what it's like to feel the impact of not conforming. We're all generally expected to be similar to everyone else in the area in which we were born. Not just our country, but our communities and our families. Not conforming can be anything from a nuisance to being a source of real danger, depending on how we don't conform and where we might have the fortune or misfortune to live. We are raised to think, act, and even dress in a certain manner, and it is often expected that we will not divert from the roles the adults in our lives had set out for us. I think we all know it's almost never that simple. As much as conformity is valued, we are all individuals with vastly different personalities. Some of us will come to the conclusion that what is expected of us is not actually right for us. Some of us will realize that those expectations are actually not feasible or even outright wrong. And some of us will be incapable of conforming to the expectations given for a myriad of reasons. This failure to conform is becoming more and more prevalent and acceptable to be the outlier, to stand on our own and take a different path. However, this new boldness and courage of those who dare to be different is causing a disturbance in the fabric of the status quo, and there are many who want to stifle this change. Yet, for all the value placed on conformity, it's not even always possible or valued by everyone. Personally, I've been a nonconformist for the majority of my adult life and had nonconformist tendencies even before that. I didn't always understand what that meant or why I preferred to be different from most, but that's definitely a large part of who I am. The desire to be an outlier has always been so strong that I sometimes don't even realize I'm making decisions based on being different. But as many of my friends can attest, I'm kind of a weirdo and comfortable being the odd one out. I'm pretty lucky though. I live in a place where being different isn't that big of a deal. Canada prides itself on being multicultural and accepting of just about anyone. I was also born with some advantages that elude others in our society. Yet even I have experienced some of the negative impacts of not conforming. I'm a woman who does not follow the stereotypes of her gender, choosing not to have children, and eschewing housework in favor of debating theists online or running podcasts. Not wanting to be a mother really seems to perplex people too, yet to me that's just who I am. Motherhood is not appealing to me in the least, and I have actually been told that I'm selfish and will live a vastly unfulfilled life if I don't have kids, or I'm denying my maternal instinct, or even denying my femininity. Yeah, but that's bullshit. I'm also an atheist. And not just one of those polite, quiet atheists that want to coexist. I'm anti-theism, loud, opinionated, and I love to have a good debate. I am sure many of you watching can imagine the fun things that I've been called for daring to not believe in God. I've been accosted at meetups, in coffee shops, and even by the returning officer I worked with at the last election. Stuck with an evangelical for 14 hours, you can imagine how fun that was. I'm also a vocal ally of LGBTQI rights, and I will suffer no excuses for not supporting their rights to be treated with the same dignity and respect as other people. I have been called all manner of things, and I've been told I should be executed as a faggot lover, and ironically, I've been told it's a good thing I don't have kids because I'll turn them all gay. Make up your damn minds already. Well, in my 20s, I found out what goth was, and then I really found my nonconformist groove. When people yelled out, "Hey, Halloween's over!" out of the car, I would yell back, "Good, you can take the costume off now." I've literally had women pull their children away from me in disgust, and I was once kicked out of a cemetery in Chicago for being disrespectful, merely for how I looked. A goth is the last person likely to be disrespectful in a cemetery, people. Now, as a Canadian, I always joke that I will be deported someday because I can't stand hockey or beer, I hate winter, and I don't even like Tim Hortons coffee. Also, I've never seen Game of Thrones, American Idol, The Walking Dead, or anything with Twilight in the title. Real vampires do not sparkle, people. I get largely good-natured ribbing for this, but the people who make fun of my BlackBerry, yeah, I don't know about those people. So, even though my nonconformity is largely chosen and not terribly divergent, I've still experienced the disapproval of greater society for my failure to conform. And for many others, the fallout can be much, much worse. So why is conformity so important to society at large? Well, the idea has been with us for a very long time, and when it was conceived as a beneficial trait to have, and it was a beneficial trait. Humans are social creatures. We have a strong need to be around other people, to interact and form relationships with each other. Just Google the impacts of loneliness and you will get lists of articles from various psychology websites outlining the negative impacts that being alone or yearning for the company of others and your peers can have. We really need companionship. Yet, historically, from the dawn of our emerging society, being around other people wasn't always a good thing. You would know that your family unit was generally safe and maybe some extended family you lived with. And as hunter-gatherers, we formed these kinds of family groups for general survival. And chances were that if you encountered a person outside your familial tribe, they might try and hurt you or steal your resources. Time progressed and societies became more complex. We formed villages, towns, cities, kingdoms, and countries. When the potential threats came on a larger scale with competing kingdoms and countries vying for land, livestock, serfs, peasants, and other resources, the need to be loyal to the group you belonged to was still important. The structure of those groups would help ensure protection for the family to the local magistrate, lord, nobleman, and monarch. Each was tasked to protect the larger community that they were responsible for. Loyalty to your clan or tribe helped keep you safe and prosperous. Over time, ways to distinguish who was safe emerged. Foreigners were usually easy to spot, having different features, manners of dress, cultural habits, languages, and even religion. On a more local level, people developed things like tribal ornaments, color schemes, tartans, and in the case of the nobility, heraldry and livery to make it more obvious who was loyal to whom. Foreigners were always suspect, and it was often the case that they were on missions from other monarchs or various leaders to benefit their homelands. This could be as simple as setting up trade deals and routes that were more beneficial to their country than the country they wanted to trade with, or it could be as dangerous as spying for weaknesses and ways to infiltrate and have a successful invasion. The Vikings were a really good example of this. Their culture was one of warriors who conquered other lands for their prosperity and survival. When they encountered the first Britons in the monastery of Lindisfarne, they didn't ask the monks if they wanted to trade. They barged in, killed virtually everyone, and took all their valuables. The Romans are another great example of why foreigners were usually dangerous. They felt that it was their right to conquer any lands they came across, not only claiming those lands, but forcing the people living there to assimilate to the Roman way of life. Those who resisted were killed or became slaves. So it made sense that a citizen of the ancient world would want to keep to their own people. The ways that people could distinguish us from them became paramount, and it was this need to reinforce the tribal mentality that also made conformity so very important. To the ancient denizen, the best way to make sure that someone was part of the us was if they looked, talked, acted, and believed the same as everyone else. That is how tribalism and conformity became interlocked with each other. It's an interdependence that has become incredibly strong over the centuries, to the point that one expects to be able to instantly recognize many key features about someone based on their origins and appearance. We realized that if people were allowed to just think and act and dress however they wanted, that instant recognition would become quite difficult or nearly impossible. Sure, they would be physical characteristics that would likely distinguish a foreigner, like maybe skin color, but for most of society's existence, people didn't travel very far from their place of birth. If everyone looked pretty much the same, there would be no way to tell who supported what feudal lord, who was one of those icky new Protestants, who might be a rebel against the crown. So conformity became the way that society operated. Laws were enacted to ensure conformity, and those laws were often supported by religion and threat of punishment by a deity. Indeed, religion evolved to value conformity in very much the same fashion, and it began working in concert with government to maintain power over the masses. In many countries, the classes were enforced by law, as well as the structure of families, like who can marry whom, who can inherit from who, etc., and what you were allowed to believe. In England, something called Sumptuary Laws were enacted so that people could tell what class someone was by how they dressed. Religions would require adherents to dress in certain attire with specific costumes for specific roles within the religious structure. Anyone should be able to tell who was a Christian monk, a priest, a lord, a merchant, or a monarch just by looking at them. Even in the ancient holy books, it's claimed that God set down the rules for his followers to distinguish themselves from the heathens and the Gentiles. Don't cut your beard, let the sides of your hair grow, be modest, wear a head covering, and do not look like those other people. It even went as far as cutting off parts of the body, as we all know that every male who was raised Jewish on the planet has had his foreskin removed. Some body modifications were not necessarily religious, but would also serve to easily distinguish who belonged to which societal group. The Burmese women who wear rings around their necks to stretch them out come to mind. Or other cultures who practice tattooing or scarification or different types of piercings. Religion also brings in the idea of the chosen people, adding another layer to the need to maintain a separate and conforming group. If your God only favors your people, it's probably a good idea to not stray from that group. The Bible and the Quran talk about setting oneself apart from other cultures of the time and not mixing with those people in any more than was absolutely necessary. In some stories, those deities even command eradication of those who refuse to conform, a sad ideal that is unfortunately still believed by some people today. In the context of different equals dangerous, it does make some sense to keep to what you know and to cultivate a homogeneous culture. From the viewpoint of a monarch, a ruler, a head of state, it also makes sense to keep everyone wanting to conform and cling to that familiar group. People who dress, think, believe, and act alike are much easier to control and in some cases exploit. And this brings me to other motivations we have to conform that have arisen from the roots of tribalism. We gain positive things from conformity, like acceptance by the communities that we live in, including the family unit. Conformity also gives us validation and confirmation of our value to the group, something that we all crave on some level. To be valued and respected are some of our basic emotional and psychological needs. While we have continued to evolve as a society over the centuries, our need and desire to conform have changed to some degree as well. The focus on conformity is not based in safety nearly as much as it was initially. The shift has now gone towards the maintenance of power. In the family unit, the parents and elders seek to maintain control over the newer generations to instill the values and expectations they have for their offspring. On a larger scale, governments still use conformity to maintain control and order over the populations that have grown to sizes never even remotely conceived of in the past. Religion, too, has seen the value of conformity in maintaining power, and their usage parallels that of government. What these institutions have learned is that the whole us versus them dynamic can be a fantastic unifier, and they seek to exploit that idea as much as possible. From their perspective, we still need that tribalist attitude and conformist society. I say we've actually outgrown our training wheels, and they're just holding us back from getting that big kid bike. Unfortunately for society as a whole, we've got some serious growing pains going on, and I contend that this dependence on tribalism and conformity are the root causes of most of it. Let's look at some ways that the perceived need for tribalism and conformity still have strong influences throughout our society and are causing problems. Everything starts at home, really, so the family unit is a good place to begin. Throughout most of history, we have stuck to what we call the nuclear family, meaning husband, wife, and their children. This may be complemented by some extended family like grandparents or aunts and uncles, but the basic structure has been the same for a very long time. A man, a woman, and children. This was the best way to ensure survival of the offspring for much of our existence, so it has remained pretty constant. I realize things like polygamy and polyandry have and do exist, but they're not really the norm across the world. The thing is, we don't need to structure our families this way any longer. The science of procreation has risen to technology that continues to break new ground, one of the most game-changing of these being the discovery of DNA and the ability to determine paternity. Ensuring bloodlines has been the cause of many restrictions around the family structure and the laws enacted to maintain this. When there could be doubt to the paternity of a child, the only way throughout history to ensure that it was the right father was to restrict who women were allowed to have sex with. This is no longer an issue. A cheek swab and a trip to the Maury show can tell you who's your daddy. Women were also often maligned for not producing male children, healthy children, or any children at all. This is no longer something that can be blamed on one gender or even necessarily one partner, and we now don't even need to have sex at all to procreate. Indeed, women and men don't need to form families with opposite sex partners either. Again, this norm was largely used to promote procreation, as well as a general control mechanism often used by religion. Well, 2 men and 2 women can now have children via surrogates or choosing to each carry a child. Some might ask siblings for eggs or sperm donation to bring the family genes into the child. And there's technology on the cusp of development that would allow DNA from a same-sex partner to be added to the nucleus of an egg so that each partner's DNA would be present. Transgender people can also procreate with their partners using many of the same techniques. Some trans men choose to give birth before having the, quote, bottom surgery, or some choose not to have surgery at all. Adoption is always another option. And then there are child-free folks like me who forego the process altogether. There's absolutely no need to cling to the idea that a family is a cis heterosexual couple with children. Aside from the procreation issue, there's also the idea of gender roles. This is linked to the idea of procreation as well, and the roles historically needed to maintain a household and raise children. Because women birthed the babies and were the baby's initial source of food, it made more sense for her to maintain the children in the home while the man, who was also physically stronger, went out and secured the food and other resources. This dynamic has fundamentally changed as we've evolved, and it is now completely unnecessary to cling to these antiquated roles either. Family resources are usually obtained with money, and any adult in the family can obtain money on some level. Women often become the, quote, breadwinner, and men are starting to choose to take care of the children more and more all the time. We have families with 2 dads and 2 moms. We have families with trans people, and in those families, responsibilities are also shared on a more equal level. Indeed, in our Western culture, we've managed to make good progress in letting go of those old roles. Much better than some places like Saudi Arabia, who won't even let women drive for fear that they'll get raped or damage their ovaries. So, of course, there's no need to conform to the sexist ideal of who does what in a family either. I believe this bleeds over into all forms of sexism too, as the family roles are where stereotypes of women and men initially become entrenched. Social conservatives have been fighting this change tooth and nail, of course, trying to enact laws that prohibit non-traditional marriages and families, and advocating discrimination against those who refuse to conform to the, quote, norm. For them, social conformity is the only way society can maintain a healthy existence, but they refuse to look beyond their own noses at reality. We don't need to conform to anyone else's idea of what a family is, what gender should be, or who we should love and have sex with. Outside the family, religion tends to have the most influence in our society, still today, unfortunately. Now, most of you will agree that conformity to this ideal is, well, less than ideal. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be watching an online atheist convention. But let's look at what is happening here for a moment. Religion came into existence for many reasons, one of the main ones being to explain things that we were unable to explain at the time. As our knowledge of the world we live in grew, old deities and their respective religions began to die off. We now understand why thunder and lightning occurs, so we don't need to believe that Zeus had anything to do with it any longer. We've gained an incredible amount of knowledge since humans began educating themselves, and the number of gods on active circulation has dwindled as a result. Yet, as we've transitioned from the ancient to the modern era, leaders began to realize that less is more. Thus, monotheism as we know it became dominant, and with it, the great enforcer of conformity. As I mentioned earlier, some religions employ outward identifiers such as head coverings, facial hair, styles of dress, religious symbology to make it plain who follows what faith. Interestingly, something else began to happen with increased frequency. Religion tried to conform to the new information being discovered. Both the Bible and the Quran tried to bring the then rudimentary understanding of science into their doctrines to show that their overall ideas could still be valid. Even today, I get Christians and Muslims trying to tell me that their God was telling humanity about the wonders of science centuries before anyone could possibly have known. Of course, we know that this is just manipulation of translations and interpretations to fit the narrative that they want to have in the present. Regardless, religion is becoming more and more irrelevant to us all the time, And as many of us know, the nones, or non-religious, are growing exponentially all the time. The result of this is religion is doing its best to force the conformity it previously enjoyed by any means it can muster. In America, now that the war on marriage equality has been lost, the religious are attacking the rights of trans people and are stepping up their attacks on women's reproductive rights. Globally, extremists like Daesh are trying to use terror and brute force to enforce conformity back onto society. We have seen the ill effects of this drive for religious conformity for centuries. The wars fought over the sects of Islam, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the upheaval of the Reformation, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, burning heretics, witch trials, September 11th, abortion clinic bombings, the list just goes on and on. We can see how detrimental this is. We no longer fear people who have different beliefs than we do. We can educate ourselves about other peoples and cultures. How we can experience these things, both at home and in those actual countries. I can go online and watch videos of various religious ceremonies, watch lectures about the faiths, read books, or attend services myself if I want. We are fast becoming a global society, and we can't afford to get bogged down in the fear of those who are different. There is no need for it. The last major impact of conformity I wanted to touch on comes from the very root of the reason for conformity, racism, and the tribalist roots it sprang from. I mentioned at the beginning that it was once very important to be able to distinguish the us from them, since an unfamiliar person was far more likely to be dangerous as well. We needed to know immediately if someone was part of the tribe or not, and appearance was the quickest and easiest way to do this. A person who had different skin color or physical features was obviously an outsider and needed to be treated with suspicion or even violently removed. Over time, we even used this thought process to justify conquering other lands, subjugating those peoples, and even making them slaves. It was rationalized that this was okay because the other people were obviously a threat as they were different. Sadly, this idea seems to be so entrenched in our society, it's proving to be a hard one to eradicate. I think that anyone willing to honestly look at science and the evidence will acknowledge that there is no reason to think one race is inferior to any other, or that we should attempt to maintain one race over another. Yet these kinds of ideas persist, and the irrational fear and dislike of other races can still grip otherwise decent people. We are starting to do better, but we obviously have a long way to go. Injustices in Western culture still abound, and people of color still have many struggles that they should not ever have to be facing. In other parts of the world, genocide and ethnic cleansing still happens, and some places still even practice slavery. It is a long, slow process, but I think we'll eventually get there. There are many other ways that tribalism and conformity are negatively impacting us, but these to me are the most egregious and prolific, and the examples that best showcase this impact. We know that tribalism and conformism that goes with it were once tools that were very beneficial to our survival. We needed to know how to distinguish who was a threat and who wasn't in the most efficient way possible, and conformity was a great way to achieve this. But we're in the 21st century now, and we've really outgrown this need. We just need to realize it. Those of you watching this will likely be more comfortable with this idea than many, merely by virtue of having embraced atheism and secularism. But that certainly isn't conforming to the majority of how many of us were likely raised. I think we need to keep the momentum going. We need to celebrate diversity and nonconformity whenever possible. Encourage our children to be okay with different, be it in others they interact with or within themselves. Encourage our peers to learn more about people who are different and what those differences mean. Encourage each other to think about why we do things the way we do or hold a certain opinion or attitude. Don't be afraid to question the status quo. I truly believe that we can make huge inroads to solving the issues I've outlined if we can become less comfortable with conformity and more comfortable with individuality and diversity. We need to stop having expectations of what should be and accept what is. And more than anything else, don't be afraid to be different yourself. Be the outlier, stand out in the crowd, buck the trends, stick out like a sore thumb. The more of us who do it because we can will make it easier for those who want to and can't. Thank you.